Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are just waiting for folks to come in and then we will get started shortly. Thank you for being with us today. This is always my awkward pause where I want to kind of like sing and dance. I don't know what to do with myself, but welcome to this event. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome. We are giving everyone a few minutes to come into the event and we will get started at 12:05. Thank you for being here. Welcome. We'll get started shortly. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining. We are going to get started in about 2 minutes, just giving everyone a minute to come into the event. Thank you for being here. Hannah, do you sing? Do you want to provide background noise? Chang, Rachel?
I won't subject the audience to that.
I've moderated 2 other events at TechEquity, and both times I think I've talked about the fact that Marion, our director of content, can sing, and I feel like it's a very light threat that we should have them singing in the background during this waiting period. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining, we're going to start in about 1 minute. We'll get started at 12:05. All right, welcome. Hello, everyone. It is 12:05. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to TechEquity's event on the Contract Worker Disparity Project. My name is Sam Gordon. My pronouns are she and her, and I am TechEquity's SVP for Organizing and Advocacy. And I'm so excited to be here with you all today talking about this really important issue. I'm really excited that we are joined by 3 fabulous panelists for our discussion today. And before I hand over to them to introduce themselves, I wanted to just do a quick overview for any of you that are new to TechEquity on who we are and what we do. So TechEquity, we engage tech workers to take action on building an economy where everyone can benefit from the growth that the tech industry has created. So we do that really in 3 ways. First is we educate people with events like these. Second is we do public policy. We work in partnership with community groups to develop a set of public policy priorities to advance our mission and hopefully create structural change. And third is we do corporate practice. So where companies are willing to do the work to make some of these changes and improve the experience for their employees and the communities in which they occupy or sit in, we help advise them on corporate practice to benefit those constituencies and make that impact meaningful. So the two areas that we focus on are housing and labor. So want to thank you all for being here today. We love being able to provide these events to you. I can't wait to meet many of you in person someday, hopefully, Delta variant pending. And if you love these events and get something out of them, I would ask if you're able to contribute to the organization. One easy way to do that is to become a member of TechEquity, which you can do by giving $10 a month or $100 a year. Herman Calderon, our community manager, is here and in the chat. All of you probably saw his message. He will drop the link to that membership sign up, and would love for you to join us and become a member and join our community. And then a couple other quick things of housekeeping. One is for our events, we use a code of conduct. We'll drop a link to that as well. Essentially what it says is we try to create safe spaces for learning that can include everyone. So please just be respectful of your fellow attendees and their opinions. Feel free to use the chat, respecting that code of conduct. And then the last sort of housekeeping thing is we will have Q&A at the end. So please, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A button, not in the chat, so we don't miss them, which I think all of us are Zoomer experts at this point. So thanks for that. So this event, the Contract Worker Disparity Project, we launched this project in April of this year, really to shine light on this growing problem that all of you are probably aware if you wanted to come to this event. Growing problem of inequality between direct employees of the tech companies and contract workers that tech employs. So just for some history, the project for us at TechEquity came out of work that we did a couple of years ago with Silicon Valley Rising. They were bringing together service workers that work on tech campuses and helping them raise standards. So through that project, resulted in a responsible contracting standard that many tech companies have signed on to, and those workers have gone on to form unions and win significant improvements in their wages, benefits, and working conditions. And through that work, when we were, talking to tech workers about these folks and about a responsible contracting standard, we started hearing from people, that there's this other class of workers that's really not visible to the public and often to many people just even working inside of tech companies. And that this class of contracted workers was often receiving disparate treatment, whether it's lower pay or no benefits, no time off, all sorts of things that weren't in line with the experience of a direct employee at a tech company. And obviously, the reporting started to kick up on this issue. Many of you have probably seen there's been lots of coverage on this at specific companies. So we started exploring it. And I know there's been incredible work done by a lot of the worker advocates inside of companies. In particular, want to lift up the work that Alphabet Workers Union has done, really structuring their union to be able to include contractors and advocate on a lot of these issues. But we know that that's not happening industry-wide, and that a lot of this work is kind of invisible to average folks. And so we decided to dig a little deeper, and that's how this project was born. So we released our launch announcement, like I said, in April, and we've actually put out 2 papers so far, one on working conditions for contractors in tech and one on sort of the staffing agency ecosystem. And we're running a survey right now for contract workers. So if any of you are a contract worker and haven't taken that survey, please do. We'll send you the link. Or if you've ever been one, feel free to take it. And if you know people that are contract workers, please share it with them. We're really trying to center this project on the lived experience of contract workers and hearing from them to help identify what the problems are and what potential solutions might look like. So having that input and those conversations is really, really valuable for this project to work. So all of that said, I'd like to actually introduce our panelists, and I'm actually going to make space for each of them to introduce themselves. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Hannah to say a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hannah Holloway, she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Policy Manager with TechEquity Collaborative, And I, since April, have been primarily leading on a lot of our day-to-day work around the Contract Worker Disparity Project, have been interviewing a lot of the contract workers that we've spoken to so far, as well as pairing that out with our industry-wide survey and additional policy research around it. So happy to be here in conversation with the other panelists.
Thank you. Chang, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Chang Fuerte. My pronouns are they, them. I am a former contract worker from Google Brand Studio. I decided to whistleblow about my experience with them on a platform that you might be familiar with called Medium, which is how I got connected to TechEquity. And although the investigation is over, the work is not, and that is why I'm still speaking here today. Happy to be here.
Thanks for being here. And Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Rachel Williams Demsey. My pronouns are she, her, and I am an attorney at the law firm of Outten and Golden, where I work on plaintiff side employment and civil rights class action cases. So I've represented engineers suing Uber for employment discrimination, DACA recipients suing Wells Fargo for lending discrimination, and a group of immigration detainees suing the Geo Group for forced labor. I also do a lot of work related to employee rights and employment status in California, and represent both the kinds of contract workers we're going to be talking about today, and also app-based workers classified by their employers as independent contractors.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here today and for sharing your experience and expertise on this topic. So Chang, I'd actually like to start with you. So you alluded to this, but you shared a lot of your experience in a public facing blog post on Medium, and really laid out what it was like to be a contract worker at a large tech firm. And I've been a labor organizer for just shy of 15 years, so I know what a risk that is for workers to publicly share what happened. And when I read through your account, the thing that really struck me was not only the misconduct you experienced, but how it was exacerbated by your status as a contract worker. And I wondered if you could just talk about how your experience as a contractor shaped the way you were able to address the issues you experienced within the workplace.
Yeah, that's such an important question. I'm glad you asked it. Before I dive into it, I just want to let everyone know that one of the ways my PTSD manifests is through stuttering. And so if I begin stuttering, it's just because I'm trying to process the information as best as I can while managing my triggers at the same time. I think I've gotten better at it. Speaking on panels like this helps me get better at it. So again, thank you, TechEquity, for having me today. I guess I live by the saying, you know, like fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you, and fool me a third time, I'm gonna make sure it never happens again. And so when I joined Google Brand Studio, this was my third time I had contracted at Google, but this was the first time my experience being a contractor felt the most personal, because leadership's true colors, or well, I guess I could say they're the type of people who would say they don't see any color, showed how they decided to show up as a brand and react during the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and a wildfire over a gender reveal party, and after that, the murder of 9 Asian women who worked at a spa. And their creative strategy around that was to oversaturate people's feeds with toxic positivity. And so when I was brought on as a creative strategist, I was tasked with the job to surface the many ways people were searching on Google in order to shape and even lead these really large, big $1 million campaigns, such as Year in Search or the Super Bowl or the Grammys. And I just remember during that time, the searches that I was seeing were just like so painful and so horrifying and absolutely triggering. And when I would present these things like, yo, like people are really scared about COVID. People are really wondering what's going on in the world. People don't really know what passive bystander is. Like people were legit searching these questions on Google, but instead leadership was like, we need you to dig for more of the positive searches. Despite Google being a brand that constantly touts on the media that they never editorialize their data. And so while I was processing all of that, my rose-colored glasses of being a creative at Google Brand Studio were just like quickly shattered because I was forced to look around, and I noticed that all of my colleagues who were of color, with the exception of one Black man, were in junior positions and we're also contract workers, despite us being the ones actually contributing to and driving the work. And so I began to be very vocal about this while I was still contracted there. Essentially, it still pains me to this day that my manager at the time and all of leadership, instead of addressing those issues, simply decided to toss me aside due to quote unquote COVID-19 budget cuts, despite the fact that they hired 6 white men full time within less than a month of me being let go. And yet, because I'm a contract worker, the investigation ended up being ruled as not an act of retaliation, but as a one-off experience, which only furthered the gaslighting that I was already going through. And to top it all off, those Google searches and ideas that I had pitched at the beginning of the pandemic and the second movement of Black Lives Matter that were ignored essentially ended up getting used when I got let go and my manager ended up getting promoted. So I don't necessarily think it was my experience as a contractor that compelled me to speak out, because I had published it after I already got let go and I was like, I have nothing else to lose anymore. It was more so my experience as a queer trans person of color navigating an overwhelmingly white liberal corporate space and noticing the disparities in that.
Thanks for sharing that, Chang. When I read your blog post, it was really intense what had happened. So I appreciate you being willing to share some of that experience with us. Hannah, I know you're leading the research and really leading this project for TechEquity, and you've been doing a lot of worker interviews. And I am reading other group studies and reports, and I wonder if the experiences that Chang is lifting up are typical, and what patterns you're seeing across the contract workforce inside of tech companies.
Yeah, I would say they're largely typical. We are seeing, so we're doing a series of worker interviews, and then as I think I mentioned, we're also running an industry-wide survey that's ongoing. So we just have preliminary results from that. But I think the demographic pieces that Chang mentioned are typical. In particular, Black, Latino, and Native American contract workers are overrepresented compared to their representation within the tech workforce overall. I also think the pieces that Chang mentioned about really the precarity of the role and whether that contributed to their decision to whistleblow is something that I'm hearing from a lot of workers as well. So there's a lot of discretion put in the hands of direct tech managers about when and for how long contract workers' contracts get extended. And when all of your job stability is in the hands or at the discretion of one subjective person, it makes it hard to, while you're in the job at least, and even when you're out of the job. So I need to give credit where credit is due to Chang's courage to whistleblow. But it makes it hard to, one, negotiate for either a higher wage or better benefits or anything like that, but also to speak up about misconduct. And so I think that's definitely a trend that we're seeing from the workers that we're speaking with and hearing from through the survey. I also think this, because of that, the way that contracts get extended or continued on, there's a sense of stagnation that I'm hearing from a lot of the workers through our survey, at least through the preliminary data. There are very minimal wage increases that contract workers receive while they're working. I think 75% said that they're very unlikely to receive a wage increase, and just 16% have actually converted to direct employment. And so I think there's a sense that though they came into it hoping that it could be sort of a pathway into more stable employment, in reality, it's unfortunately seen as a dead end job. So you either work through the contract until they cancel it, or you get fed up and leave. So yeah, I think pulling on the themes that Chang mentioned, those are some of the ones that we're seeing overall, in particular, the precarity of it, the sort of demographics, the overrepresentation in the demographics of it, and what that means for how power is held and shows up in these dynamics on these teams and in the companies overall.
Great, that makes sense. Rachel, I'm going to hand to you. You mentioned this in your bio, but just so folks know, you're a really experienced lawyer in the tech space. And I know a lot of times when we talk about issues of workplace misconduct or, share stories like the one that Chang just shared, a lot of the response I've gotten is, well, those must be one-offs, right? Those must be, random situations. Why would a tech company set up an agreement or these types of arrangements if these are the results? And so I wondered if you could kind of walk the audience through why companies do this and why they set up these types of arrangements and what their incentives are for having structures that can operate this way.
Sure, yeah. So just to sort of clarify vocabulary right at the beginning, there in the fall in particular, there was a lot of discussion of independent contractors that work for gig companies, that work for app-based companies. So like independent contractors with Uber and Lyft and DoorDash. And I just want to sort of clarify at the beginning that that's a different issue than what we're talking about. So if you classify a worker as an independent contractor, they're not subject to any employment protections at all, basically. They're sort of seen to be in business for themselves. They don't get minimum wage protections. They don't get overtime protections. They don't have access to anti-discrimination laws, anything like that. What we're talking about today is something slightly different in that contract workers in Silicon Valley, and as you noted, Samantha and Hannah, this is a really common employment structure in Silicon Valley in particular. I think something like 50% of Google's, the people who work for Google are actually contract workers. And what being a contract worker for a company like Google means is that your employer is actually not Google. Your employer is a third-party company who basically provides employees to Google for a specific period of time according to a contract between the sort of third-party employer and Google. So contract workers in this context are still employees in that they're subject to employment laws. So they have to get things like minimum wage, they have to get things like overtime, and they are covered by employment laws, but basically the person who, the sort of entity that is legally liable for them or legally responsible for them is not a company like Google. It's not the sort of company that they fit visibly to all, intents and purposes. Everybody looks at them and says, oh, that person works for Google, but Google is not liable for them. The third-party contractor is liable for them. And companies like Google love this because they like to limit their liability. They don't want people suing them. They don't want these laws enforced against them. And so they're able to basically a lot of this is just outsourcing their liability. So they outsource their liability to these third-party companies. And it means that experiences like Chang's are common because Google doesn't have a reason really to care about discrimination or hostile work environment. That's not necessarily its problem, and certainly that's the legal argument that they would make, that it's not their problem. It's the sort of quote unquote employer's problem. It's the third party company's problem, and companies are always looking for ways to limit their liability so that they can treat their workers however they want to. And that's really the primary benefit that they get from this, is that they don't have to. They are able to basically not take responsibility for the experiences that these contract workers have. There are some limits to that, which we may get into later. So it can be possible to sue companies like Google as a joint employer, and there are certain legal standards for that. But generally speaking, one of the primary benefits they get is that they just don't have to take legal responsibility for the experiences that these contract workers have working for them.
Thanks, Rachel. I think that's really helpful, and to hopefully sort of knit together this picture and help folks that may be like, where does all of this fit? So Chang, when you're sharing your experience, that was managers were from Google, right? Not from your staffing agency that you were experiencing the misconduct from, right? And then the staffing agency, like Rachel was laying out, is sort of the employer on paper, right? So Chang, you probably got recruited through them, signed your paperwork through them, get paid through them, but your day-to-day management is coming from the tech company. And that's the structure that we see, not just at Google, we see it across multiple companies in the tech industry. So just wanted to kind of help folks that might be new to this sort of structure and arrangement see those pieces fitting together. So to dial down into some of the specifics, I'm asking some just like frame questions because I think they're the ones that have been coming out from different people we've talked to about this project. But one of the questions that's come up a lot is, direct employees in tech are sort of notoriously paid well, right? Are the contractors paid well? Also, that's sort of the expectation is, a lot of these contractors in tech are paid well. Is there an issue if the wages are high? And I wondered, Chang, having been a contract worker, is this a question you've gotten as you've shared your experience? And could you speak to sort of this issue and you're talking about what the working conditions are like and why it's not just a question of wage. I wondered if you could speak about this as well.
Yeah, when contracting work became really hot through Google's main sourcer, which is Adecco, that was back in 2014 for me. I remember that was the hot question about like how much do you make in comparison to a full-time employee. But I think as the years have progressed, conversations around survival under capitalism has quickly changed beyond like how much are you making and more about how are you being treated at work. And so to your point earlier about how my main employer would have technically been or is on paper Adecco, contractors actually don't have an on-site HR. So anytime I had an issue or a problem with anything, I had no one to turn to. And if I absolutely needed to, it was a report that was often swept under the rug because my manager at Google would have to play middleman and directly contact my agency. And so if I wanted to directly contact my agency and find out who the HR person is that I would talk to, it was just, I would have to catch them up from the beginning of like my first day. And it's just constant phone and email interviews of trying to catch them up when it would have been so much easier if I had somebody on site with me to speak to my relationships with my managers. Another thing is that in comparison to full-time people, we do not have performance reviews. Your full-time manager is actually not allowed to give you one. And that's why it's harder for you to justify a raise increase because they are not allowed to tell you whether you are worthy of getting one or not. And they say that it's something that you need to take up with your hiring agency, who obviously has not been in the weeds of the work that you do and cannot attest or deny whether or not what you're saying is true because they're not part of that conversation at all. I could even tell you I've never met any of the people who have contracted me through Adecco. So that's like a whole other thing, but I have been interviewed by so many people at Google to get the contracting jobs that I did. And so that's like another very alarming thing to me. And as far as like perks and benefits, where we do not, if you work in the creative marketing field specifically, if you are a contractor, you are not allowed to present your work unless your full-time manager approves that, because they are supposed to be the ones to speak on behalf of your work because they're the ones managing you. And so I was lucky at the beginning where I had a manager who did let me speak a lot about my work, but that wasn't the case for a lot of my colleagues. And so in addition to that, they also say that you cannot participate in ERGs, which are employee resource groups. You're left out of that conversation. You are required to still come to work during company-wide mental health days or even holidays. There are meetings and emails that you're not included in. So when COVID first started, contractors were the last to find out that Sundar had sent the email that he wanted everybody to stay at home. And we were all still going to work and we had no idea that this email got sent out. I think like when I also think about like the poorest working conditions that I've been in, my first contractor role at Google, I thought I was going to be a product manager for Google Express. But since it was in beta at the time, my recruiter told me it was like super confidential. But because of the money and because of the name I would get to have on my resume that I worked at Google, I quickly accepted the offer without asking any further questions. The next thing you know, I was telling Hannah this, I found out I would be working at the back of a Costco in a makeshift warehouse and packing and shipping orders, like many of you are familiar with when it comes to Amazon Prime. And there was a day where it was pouring rain, and all we have as uniforms are our collared shirts that say Google on it. They did not supply us rain boots. They did not supply us rain jackets, but they still expected us to come to work in that makeshift warehouse in the back of a Costco. And I mean, if those are things that you can tolerate, I'd love to know what your self-care practices are. But as far as my individual well-being in a work setting, I knew I just like don't deserve that kind of treatment, especially as somebody who feels that they have worked very hard to get where they're at in their career. So yeah, that's just like in a nutshell what my experience of being a contract worker has been.
That's wild that you showed up at the back of a Costco like that. It is quite an imagery. Wow. Yeah, okay, I'm reacting to that. All right, so that is, I think really helpful for people to understand sort of that I think in a lot of jobs, especially when you're a direct employee, the wage is the focus, right? But when you're in a contracted role, there's so many other things that become precarious. And so even if your wages are good, I know I interviewed a contract worker who had shared, that they haven't had a day off. They don't get days off outside of the state mandated paid sick, right? So it's like, okay, my wages are good for 2 months. I have guaranteed, and then maybe I get extended, but like, how do you get an apartment? Even if your wage is good for 2 months, I can't guarantee I have good wages in month 3. So just helping people to understand that the precarity of this goes way beyond whatever the wage rate is on paper, which for some folks is good on paper and some folks not. So one other question I kind of had on the specifics on contracting is for you, Rachel, is you talked about this some on the distinction between independent contracting and these types of contracting arrangements where you are an employee, but of a third party agency. And I wondered if you could just talk about, you alluded to it in that overview, sort of, when you go as an employee of a job, you're protected by a host of laws, right, at the state and federal level. And what laws still apply here, and how are they different, or how should we think of them when they come to contract workers? And essentially, I guess what I'm asking is, are contractors in this, framework, not independent contractors, are they less protected than direct employees? And if so, if you could kind of walk people through that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It has a little bit of a complicated answer. The short answer is because they're employees, employment laws apply to them. So federal employment laws apply to them, and state employment laws apply to them. But the more complicated answer is that, as I'm sure we all know, the United States and even California, which has significantly stronger employee protections than are available on a federal level, has a lot of gaps in the protections that are available to employees. So for example, there's no requirement that you provide employees with time off, really of any sort. In California, I think as of recently, there's like, you're required to have 3 sick days a year, but that's still not a lot. And generally, these sort of protections that we all think of as benefits of employment, healthcare subsidies, and vacation and retirement contributions, all of that are basically voluntary. They're things that employers provide employees in order to attract them. And one of the big benefits to this sort of contracting structure is that even if companies can boast that they have great employee benefits, but they don't have to give them to half of their workforce because they are not employees of the sort of big companies, they're employees of these third-party contractors. So that is part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that at some level, there are a lot of protections that are sort of only as good as your ability to enforce them. And a good example of that is, sort of discrimination and harassment laws. There are laws against discrimination and harassment, sure doesn't stop it from happening, which is why you need to be able to, legally enforce those laws. And for a lot of reasons, sort of often size and reputation and that sort of thing. It can be much harder to enforce these laws against these third-party contractors. They don't have the same reputations on the line. They may be more difficult to negotiate with. Sometimes the contractors will, be sort of small fly-by-night type of organizations that it would be very hard to get to pay a judgment at all, which makes it hard to sue them. So in all of those ways, in practice, contractors have a lot fewer protections, both sort of the voluntary protections that employers provide their full-time employees and the ability to sort of seek recourse through the courts.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know we've talked some about this, so Hannah, feel free to say if it's mostly been covered, but I know connected to the legal point and sort of what Rachel explained about companies shifting liability to a third-party contractor and getting that legal and financial liability, frankly, off their books, has made the roles for workers really precarious. And I wondered if there's anything that's not been discussed, Hannah, that you're finding from your conversations with workers about sort of the precarity of these roles and how it relates to their experience within these jobs.
Yeah, I guess I would just underscore that the precarity or the lack of job stability is very structural to this type of employment. And I think, there's of course shifting of the legal liability. I think commonly people, when they think about contracting out, they talk about how companies might do it for profit reasons. So that's certainly true to a certain extent. They save on the benefits and certain personnel costs. But one of the principal reasons that we're finding through our research is this idea of flexibility, right? Which is flexibility for the company and is a complete lack of job security for the workers. And as I mentioned earlier, when contract workers sign their contracts, it's usually for a period of something like 6 months. And throughout the duration of that contract, it just sort of gets extended at the discretion of their tech manager, sometimes without their notice. And again, as I mentioned earlier, sort of what that means for ability to negotiate, but also ability to advocate and speak up for yourself when you're constantly just relying on one person for your job security and you don't want to cause waves, right? And so I think that, plus I saw someone in the chat talking about there's also frequently a 2-year cap on contract work. And so contract workers work for 2 years, sort of in this monthly extension cycle. And then once they come up against that, they're frequently compelled to take a 6-month hiatus, do whatever. Sometimes folks can take unemployment and just write it out until they can get back into the contracting world, or other avenues before they come back. And so I think both within the contract and sort of outside and what it means for your ability to look for jobs, there's just an incredible amount of instability that for the companies is sort of defined or referred to as flexibility. And when we hear that word, it really means precarity and a lack of job stability for the workers.
Thanks, that's helpful. Some of the other topics that we were going to dig into, we've actually talked some about and want to make sure we get into ideas for moving forward. One other specific area that we've touched on lightly, but just wanted to provide an opportunity for any of you to speak on this if you have thoughts, but just is the mobility from contract work to direct employment with a tech company. So I know, Chang, you mentioned, like you jumped at the first offer, right? Because it's like Google on your resume, good wage. And I think we've heard that from a lot of contractors. We've also heard contractors at other places that were pretty clear-eyed that it wasn't with the company and they may not be able to list it on their resume. And I wonder if from you all's experience, if you could talk about sort of what compels people to take this arrangement. And are you learning anything about how easy or hard it is to convert that experience as a contractor into a full-time employment role with the company? So that's for any of you that have thoughts about that.
I think I'm going to share a resume tip with everybody here, but having Google on my resume, even though they tell you up front that you have to say that you contracted at Google, which I do have on my LinkedIn and on my resume, just in very small fine print that it says Google contractor. The amount of job opportunities I've been able to have, or the amount of people who have reached out to me just by having that name has been a massive help in my job search. So granted, it's only led to more like contract work until I led myself to the opportunity that I'm at now, which is my first full-time job. But yeah, on LinkedIn, just having the amount of people who will reach out to you for job opportunities is massive. And there are some employers that are not naive to just like look at that and bring you right on because they know you have Google in their resume. They are starting to ask like, oh, was it a contractor role or were you full-time? Which I also find very intimidating and also kind of odd, because what does it matter when you are performing the same task, regardless of whether you were full-time or contractor? So that's another conversation to probably have later down the road, but it just shows how much people pay attention to where you work and what is on your resume. And I think that's why people would still rather sacrifice their sanity to have that that generous hourly wage and that name on your resume for sure.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I would just add, a lot of the workers that we've spoken to are in the middle of a career pivot. So they've spent some amount of years in a different industry, or there's also a lot of people of color coming out of higher education programs and are trying to find their way through a very competitive job market. And so I think, I think when you're coming from that background of not either having or needing new skills in a new industry, or being unsure about your ability to land a job, contract work is a good opportunity for a lot of workers coming from those backgrounds.
Great. And before we open the Q&A, I did want to spend a little bit of time on, and then we'll hear what questions people have. Maybe it'll get addressed there. Just what ideas and solutions are already percolating in this space, right? I think there's a lot of workers and advocacy groups and different policymakers who don't want to further exacerbate this caste system, right? And like Chang, you were just talking about the stigma that's sort of developing amongst recruiters of like, were you a direct employee or were you a contractor, and why does that matter, and how do we break that down? And so I wonder if you all are familiar with any companies that are making improvements on this, and what that looks like, or what more they could be doing. I know, Hannah, you've looked some at this, but just wanted to open that to the three of you if you're familiar with companies that are trying to make this better, or what ideas that maybe workers are pushing companies to do.
If I may cut in my Medium article, I did list my demands of how they're going to move forward. And a lot of the demands were not about like my personal harm. It was like for how I can see the company doing better, specifically my department. And the most specific ask was there needs to be an on-site HR. And I know that was something that they took very seriously. And I was confirmed that that's something that they're working on. I don't know what the logistics entail as to why it's taking so long or why it's taken this long. But after I did list that in the article, they did acknowledge that that was one of the demands that they would be able to meet. So I'm glad that contractors will now have somebody in the office that they can go to and voice their concerns to.
Great. That's wonderful. Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, and building off of that, I think, again, a lot of the workers that we've spoken to have expressed a distrust of HR, certainly of the existing HR structures that are at their tech companies, and also sort of the actual HR structure that's available to them at their staffing agencies. And so as companies look to recommendations like the one that Chang offered, I would also pair that with doing deeper cultural work within the organizations to ensure that there's trust in those systems, right? And that's going to look different company to company, and it's going to be very long-term, very difficult work. But I think that, and then there are also certain emerging standards, like minimum standards for contractors at companies like Google and like SurveyMonkey that include things like complaint lines. And these are all really good, worthwhile things to pursue, but they're not going to be impactful if workers don't feel like it's safe for them to use it, right? And one of the ways, especially on the complaint line, that you can do that is by making it third party, so completely separate from the organization. So there's not this perception that it could get back to their manager or hurt them in their job stability in some way. And so I would say that there are no easy solutions, and there are no solutions that don't come with the deeper sort of cultural, structural work to fixing these problems.
I would just add one thing, which unfortunately is sort of the opposite of an answer to your question. I think, you know, the answer to your question ultimately comes down to collective organizing and people sort of working together and coordinating. And particularly my understanding is that at Google, and Chang may know more about this than me, that full-time employees really sort of organized behind contractors. And that is, you know, that's hugely helpful. And, you know, employees are all in this together. And I think that's a really good example of how people can lift each other up. So from the legally speaking, I mentioned this earlier, but there is sort of the concept of joint employer status, I think, is an important one to help understand why some of these changes can be hard to implement. And basically, so as we've discussed before, there are these sort of third-party contractors and then the employers, and then there's the tech companies, and they are sort of basically the customers, or think of themselves as the customers of the third-party contractors. But legally, if the tech companies start to sort of have a certain level of control and provide a certain level of resources to the third-party contractors, they become more and more likely to be legally held liable as joint employers of those contractors. And so that's one of the primary benefits they get out of outsourcing these jobs, right? So I think it's helpful to think about that. I'm sure there are sort of ways to work around that. And obviously there could be some sort of larger legislative fix of regulating these relationships to begin with. But within the current legal framework, I think it's helpful in terms of demands that companies can realistically agree to and sort of still get the benefits that they see from these third-party contractor relationships. If you're working within that framework, I think it's important to understand you know, what you can ask for that the companies can reasonably agree to without losing the legal protections that they are seeking from the arrangement in the first place.
Yeah. And we're running shy on time. I was going to move us to public policy and regulation next, but I'm actually going to invite Marianne Wellington, our director of content, to come on and share with us some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, so we get a chance to answer those directly. And I will commit to everyone that as we move forward in this project, we will do deeper dives definitely on joint employment and on public policy and the movement of workers that are trying to make this happen. But hopefully this is a good entry point into that conversation. Marianne.
Hi, and thank you. First of all, thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. I feel like it's definitely opened my eyes, and I hope it has for our attendees as well. So thank you very much. We have some amazing questions in the chat or in the Q&A. First, there's a couple of technical questions around the nature of contracting in tech that I'd love to get into. So someone brings up the distinction between the contract staff augmentation model versus fully managed service outsourcing model. So could anyone, this is open to anyone, really speak to the difference between those and the trade-offs for the companies, and then also the trade-offs obviously for the workers that are in these two different models, and how both models could be more equitable over time?
Do you want to do it, Hannah, or do you want me to?
Yeah. So I think of these as sort of like integrated teams versus independent teams, right? So there are models like I think what Chang experienced, where you are contracted through an agency, but besides sort of your actual contract with them, you don't have much of a relationship. You're integrated on teams with direct employees, sort of doing shared work that's sort of more internal to the company, I guess you could say. And yeah, and then there are sort of managed services, or also what's sometimes referred to as vendors. And the vendors, sort of similar to the staffing agency, have a direct employment relationship with their team, but it's more, you could think of them as like janitorial services. Sometimes it's also for like micro kitchen types of things, that they perform a more discrete service that's somewhat separate from the core business functions of what the company or the tech company in this case might be doing. And I think to the question of what both of those can do to ensure better conditions and jobs for workers, I think it's actually not a question of what they can do, although, you know, if we can compel them to change internal practice, that's great. But if tech companies are doing more vetting and sort of more upfront disclosure about retention rates, their benefits packages, what they're doing around recruiting and how they find workers, their pay scales, their sort of ability to advance, and then the companies are able to vet all of the proposals that they get from various staffing agencies against their internal values, that would be a good start to ensuring for the companies that they're working with staffing agencies and vendors who meet their internal values and honor the workers.
Great. We have a question from the audience about what types of jobs in tech are becoming contracted and how has that changed over time?
I can try, and then Chang or Rachel or Hannah should fill in behind me. I think it varies greatly from company to company is what we're finding. And one of the biggest problems in examining this issue is that the data is really lacking, honestly. So, you know, a lot of times as a labor person, you go into the Bureau of Labor Statistics to find out basic employment data, right, on companies. But there is a category for temp industry companies, but a lot of these companies don't file as a temp industry with BLS, and there's no way to tell which companies they work with. So what we know historically is that there was a move in the 90s to outsource information technology departments, and that's where a lot of these limits around timelines for contract work come out of some of the legal precedent, which Rachel could probably speak to better than me from that shift. And then over time, it's really expanded from company to company. So we see things like Google Brand Studio, which uses contractors and marketers very frequently. We also see, you know, obviously the service workers are contracted out, like Hannah was just explaining, through a vendor. There's also things like event services. Often those are contracted roles that work across multiple companies. There's also things like, you know, a lot of these tech companies, because of the great perks they have for their full-time employees, it's like people that work at the gym, the masseuse, sometimes what traditionally was called, and I understand this is gendered, but traditionally from a labor perspective, pink collar roles. So like reception, office management, those sorts of things. But it's gotten very, very wide, and it's also gotten very varied. So Hannah recently wrote a paper on the staffing agencies and showed that the sort of revenue share of these groups has increased. I can't remember the percentage, but a huge amount, while worker wages have stagnated. And so it's sort of become this behemoth that at different companies takes on huge swaths of what had traditionally been in-house work.
Yeah, I can definitely say being a contractor for Google for the past, I think 4 or 6 years, I've seen it evolve from when in 2014, it was just very, very like labor heavy, very like, you know, the warehouse workers that you see or people who would work in the cafeteria with this painted imagery of like, oh, if I work hard enough, I could work my way up the ladder. But yeah, my most recent contract, I was literally a creative strategist scripting up commercials for Google that people watch on their TV. Yeah, it's intriguing to me to see how the labor force has changed with that and how they're expanding their outsourcing. That also makes it very concerning to me as to what justifies this person to be a full-time creative strategist versus me being a contractor creative strategist. So that opens a whole nother door of investigation that I'm sure Hannah and Sam and Rachel and Marianne are working really hard to figure out. So yeah.
Great. I think we have time for about one more question. So I will sum up with this. And I think, Rachel, you touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear more from you and from everyone about what is the role of full-time employees in supporting their contracted peers? How can they act beyond complacency? And what is the risk to their jobs and well-being in speaking out? And also this person wanted to shout out and appreciate Chang's story and honesty.
So I think it depends, and Rachel, you should help from a legal perspective. It depends what kind of speaking out and solidarity work you're doing. You're still governed under labor law, and there's protected concerted activities. So it really depends. I would need to know more about what you want to do. I know that I can say just from reading media that, and Rachel mentioned this from an organizing perspective, that one of the demands of full-time employees at Google was to be able to express their frustration and publicly speak about sort of their solidarity towards contract workers. And so Google management had agreed that they should be able to express sympathy and express empathy, but didn't give a lot of details about sort of the confines of that. But there was retaliation, it sounds like, from the media reporting. I don't know that for sure, but there was direct workers were feeling like they were not allowed to speak in support of contracted workers without facing discipline. And so that was a demand that some of those folks had made. But again, you know, any of the activities, if you're talking about real action, are governed by what's considered protected concerted activity. You can Google that. I don't know, Chang or Rachel, if they want to add.
Yeah, so legally speaking, I would say there is, you know, incomplete protections against retaliation and whistleblowing for concerted activity. The National Labor Relations Act sort of specifically protects, it's a law that arose in the context of unions, but is also applicable to some employers that don't have unions, that protects the right to speak out about working conditions. And California actually also has some specific laws that protect you know, speaking out about working conditions, and also I think specifically speaking out about pay, which is one component of that, but that's a very clear protection under California law. So there are legal protections that you can enforce on a case-by-case basis, and how effective and strong they are really depends on a lot of sort of specific individual circumstances. I'm a class action lawyer, and there is just sort of inherent safety in numbers. There's only so many people at a time that an employer can retaliate against. So, you know, the more people who are speaking out about this, the better in a lot of ways. But, you know, legally speaking, there are some protections, but they vary a lot case to case. And again, you know, who is liable for them is sort of a foundational issue of this. So is whether you can sue the contractor or the sort of tech company gets complicated, and it really depends.
I also just want to give a huge shout out to Ifioma from Pinterest, who was a big mentor passively in how I should whistleblow without getting sued. She does a lot of workshops about this. So if any of you are keen to becoming a future whistleblower, Ifioma is a powerful, powerful resource. And yeah, I really owe a lot to her to making sure that my process went as smoothly as it could for what the circumstances were.
Absolutely. We are big fans of Ifoma Azoma, and hoping to put together an event with her on legislation that she ran this year and is hopefully going to go through on allowing workers to speak publicly about their experiences of harassment based on protected class. So she is a wonderful resource if you want to look her up. And I am just realizing time. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you to our panelists for being here and sharing their experience and their expertise. And thank you to Marion for facilitating our Q&A, and for all of you for joining. I'm just now reading the chat and seeing people want a longer conversation. So we will definitely do some follow-on events, and would encourage you, if you're interested and you want to talk more, we have organizers on our team who are happy to talk through sort of our projects and what we're working on. So please reach out to us, and we're happy to set up one-on-ones and talk things through with you, and make sure you're connected to the right folks. So thanks everyone again for being here, and look forward to more conversations about this. Appreciate you.